Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Ana Cláudia Ricardia. I'd like to thank Cátedra Jean Monnet, Professor Rafael Miranda, Professor Claudia Marconi for the invitation to be here hosting this panel on business and human rights in the Global South. And for today, we invited three brilliant professors that I would like to thank for being here and for accepting our invitation. Professor Dr. Salvador Herencia Carrasco. He's the director of the Human Rights Clinic at Human Rights Research and Education Center, University of Ottawa, Canada. Professor Florencia Vega Rossi, professor at the Universidade Nacional de Litoral in Argentina. Professor Daniela Pamplona, the director of the Human Rights Clinic at the Pontifical Catholic University of Paraná here in Brazil. They will talk about business and human rights here in Latin America and Global South and the challenges and prospects of their themes of knowledge, main themes of knowledge. And today, Professor Salvador will be our first panelist. You all have 20 minutes to speak about your main topics of research. Professor Salvador will talk today about business and human rights in the Inter-American system of human rights protection. Professor Salvador, thank you very much for being here today with us. And you now have 20 minutes. Afterwards, after Professor Salvador, we will have Professor Florencia Vega Rossi, and then Professor Daniela Pamplona, also with 20 minutes. And then we can have some questions of the public. And I also have a few questions myself that I would like to present to the panelists. So thank you very much, Professor Salvador. Now you have 20 minutes to present, to make your presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Rui. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you and everybody attending this webinar. Thank you very much to the Cátedra Jean Monnet for the invitation, to my colleague Rafael Miranda, and to my beloved and dear friends, Professors Pamplona, Professor Vega, and Professor Rui. It is always a pleasure and an honor to share a panel with you, regardless of the time. I am here in Canada, which means that it is 5 p.m. here, but it looks like it was midnight, so it's winter wonderland here at home. So my presentation today focuses a bit on my doctoral research and the work that we do at the Human Rights Clinic. And if I were to sum it up in one sentence, I think that I see the future of business and human rights in the Global South as possibilities. As probably you've known, and I know that you have been yesterday started this series of lectures on business and human rights. You've understood, how the origins of the field of business and human rights, and how we have now several binding instruments, or several instruments that are starting to set a lot of legal and policy changes around the world. As probably you've been discussing this, the UN Guiding Principles adopted in 2011 is the core instrument regarding the business and human rights field, but it is not the only one. We have, among others, the ILO Tripartite Declaration, and also a series of governance instruments mainly from the OECD, in addition to other international instruments and treaties, is mainly from international private law and other topics of the matter. But when we talk about the relationship between business and human rights and our inter-American human rights system, I think that what motivated me to first start looking at the business and human rights field as a potential, as a field of possibilities, is right at the start of the UN of the Guiding Principles. The commentary explicitly states that these guiding principles do not create new international obligations on states. So, for a document that attempted, or whose purpose was to enable or to consolidate the start of a new field, your starting point is saying that we're not creating new international law obligations leaves a lot to wonder and a lot to question of what is behind it, and most importantly, what's the reason to include this in such a document. But then if you put a closer inspection on the pillars that create the UN guiding principle, which are the duty to protect of states, secondly, the corporate responsibility, to respect human rights, and the access to remedy, you see that even though the text does not create new international law obligations, many of its content, if you take it away from it in isolation, they are in many ways binding legal obligations on states. Mainly, so we're at this moment we're focusing on the first pillar of the UN guiding principles. So when we started to discuss this within different colleagues from the region, including my esteemed colleagues that are with whom I'm sharing the panel tonight, we see that if you were to put or to transplant this guiding principles into our inter-American human rights system, and specifically under our American Convention of Human Rights, then we see what the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights has coined as the inter-Americanization of the field of business and human rights. And when you inter-Americanize it, then you are actually talking about, or you can actually make the argument for strong legal and binding obligations on states. And if you use the UN, and then a second element follows, which is you grab the UN guiding principles not as a document itself, which has been in a way the actions or the measures that national action plans by states have been doing in the past 10 or plus years, but then you only see it as an interpretive tool to a binding international convention. If you do that exercise with me, then you will see that we have all the tools, all the elements to move an aspirational document like the UN guiding principles into clear binding obligations of states. If you're familiar with the work of the Inter-American Human Rights System and the work of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, you will know that this is not new. So, and considering that we are presenting in a Brazilian audience, we've seen many cases where the court or the Inter-American system has used other instruments to be very specific about the obligations and reparations and responsibilities and reparations of states. The Fazenda Brasil Verde versus Brazil, and the latest firework factory workers case versus Brazil are just two examples of these elements, of this use of other instruments, regardless of their legal binding nature or not, to create specific obligations on states. Now, I could spend the rest, my remaining 13 or 14 minutes, trying to dissect the 5 or 6 decisions that the court has addressed. But before we start, I think that considering the topic of this webinar, business and human rights in the global south, the main question is, why does this matter? Why is this important? And as you know, on the weekend, I, like many of you here, probably were very disappointed and underwhelmed with the outcome of COP26 on the panel on environment, on climate change. And I was trying to make the most out of this, and somewhere I wrote, what we need is less Glasgows and more Escazús, making reference to the Escazú Agreement on environmental justice, access to information, and participation. I was trying to be a little punchy in a way, but I think that there's more to this that relates to this conference. And that is that as Global South, as developing nations, we're pretty much on our own. Because you cannot understand the field of business and human rights without taking into account, and especially for our international relations students, the power dynamics that are included or embedded in this discourse of business and human rights. And understanding this make us see that the immediate future of business and human rights is pretty grim. We are 192, if I'm not mistaken, UN members, and there's only 4 countries with a specific legislation on business and human rights. The UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has expressly stated that the past decade, the outcomes and the results of implementing legislations and procedures to address the issue of business and human rights has been insufficient. So, if we are waiting for a possible outcome, or if we are waiting for a global understanding on a treaty on business and human rights, as you say in Portuguese, espere sentado. So you better wait sitting down, because the results are going to take forever, and the outcome might not even be satisfying. So I think, and this is why the work that we do within the Human Rights Clinic and I personally engage with is related to public interest litigation, because I see it in the immediate term. If you're thinking about victims, if you're thinking about sustainable development, if you're thinking about the protection and prevention of human rights abuses, the only way that we will be able to trigger any significant change at all will be at this point through public interest litigation. If you accept this, or if you accept this premise, then all these cases, the 5 cases that the court has adjudicated to this date, make a bit more sense. The system is not perfect, but what does this mean? How can we use these tools to protect environmental defenders? How can we do this to protect victims of corporate abuse? And this, ladies and gentlemen, I say this without any political ideology. Okay? This is regardless of wherever you are in the political spectrum. And this is very important for us to understand. Just this morning, we've been working with different organizations on a case of 8 human rights defenders in Honduras where they have been in pretrial detention for over 2 years because they were defending their land, because the president of the country gave a natural reserve to his buddies. Is this fair? That you pay political favors at the cost of the people's life, people's territories? So if you see the 25 or 27 cases now from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights just on the issue of indigenous peoples, and you add the business and human rights lens to it, you will see these concerns. And whether it's Chucuru versus Brazil on issues of land titling and identification of indigenous territory, to Sarayaku and with licenses of extractive licenses given without proper authorization or without consultation or consent, you see that the issue of business and human rights and these power imbalances are at the core of the process. And these elements are also impact national legislation, but also national litigation of strategic cases. There is a case in Brazil right now at the Supreme Court. I think Professor Pamplona will explore that a bit, or maybe we can talk about it in the questions. That is pretty much that. And I think that the Inter-American Court, even though they have been very shy, not to say afraid, of properly addressing the field of business and human rights, I think that they are slowly advancing for us to fully use the American Convention, for us to, at least at a regional level, and to those state parties to the American Convention of Human Rights, to actually have legally binding standards that can help victims, that can help states, but also can help businesses implement policies that prevent and assure the respect of human rights of impacted populations. Because in the field of business and human rights, specifically in the cases that are making their way through national courts and through the Inter-American human rights system, we're not the ones affected. The 21 people registered to the seminar. These are who is affected are Afro-Indigenous communities, Quilombos, indigenous peoples, marginalized. And this is pretty much the victimology of who are making of the main users of the Inter-American human rights system. So in the case, to start to conclude my presentation, I would invite you to look into two decisions of the court that are fundamental for the immediate future of business and human rights in the Americas. The first one is the advisory opinion on environment and human rights that was adopted in 2017, which is pretty much the blueprint of the Escazú Agreement that entered into force on April of this year. And it has a lot of very important elements regarding the protection of the environment, the recognition of the environment as a protected right under the American Convention on Human Rights. It addresses the issue of extraterritorial responsibility of home states, okay? And also has a very detailed and very specific list of how an environmental and social impact assessment must fulfill in order for this one to be available, for it to fulfill inter-American standards. And the second case that I will invite you to read, if possible, is the Miskito Indigenous Peoples versus Honduras, which was adopted 2 or 3 weeks ago by the court. And this case is about fishermen in Miskito Island in Honduras, that they fish lobster without any sort of health or safety measures, in a way similar to the firework factory workers case versus Brazil, de Santo Antônio de Jesus in Bahia. But the court, in this decision, which is where the parties actually came to an agreement, the court says something very important. Businesses are the primary bearers of the responsibility to prevent human rights violations. The court says other stuff that we can discuss in the questions, but for a state-driven system like the Inter-American human rights system, it is very important for us to see also under the second pillar, which focuses on business activities and business regulations and business conducts, what must be done. This is just a first case, and there are 3 potentially landmark cases that are pending decisions within the Inter-American system. But to conclude, what would I like to say with all of these cases without entering into details at this point of every specific case? One, if we see all states of the Organization of American States, only Canada has adopted a specific norm regarding business and human rights by creating an Office of the Ombudsperson. The rest of our countries, nothing. There are only 4 countries, if I'm not mistaken, that has adopted national action plans on the field of business and human rights. And let's take, for example, my home country, Peru. Peru adopted its NAP in July 20 of this year. It has been heralded as one of the most complete NAPs in the region. Yet it doesn't include a single word about the impact of international investment agreements to the enjoyment of human rights of marginalized populations. So one of the core issues in the field of business and human rights of policy coherence is completely ignored. So if we see this pick and choose in this field due to, once again, power imbalances, economic power, what are the priorities of states? We prioritize the economy or we prioritize human rights? You don't need to be a PhD to know what the answer will be in 9 out of 10 cases. So that is why public interest litigation within the inter-American system can have a positive spillover effect in all countries in Latin American countries. And to my case, perhaps the most influential decision in the past 5 or 10 years of the Inter-American Court has been the advisory opinion on environment and human rights, which has triggered significant litigation, policy, and legal change, concluding to the Escazú Agreement. So globally, the future might be oblique, but I think that the answer in the immediate future for the field of business and human rights, at least in Latin America, is bright if we work together. Muito obrigado. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Salvador, for your brilliant presentation. 20 minutes is just like so little time. I would like to have like 1 hour just listening to all of you. But now I'll ask Professor Florencia Vagrossi to make her presentation. Professor Florencia, thank you very much for being here tonight. And tonight she's going to speak about business and human rights in Argentina and how private international law can be applied to business and human rights issues also here in the region in Latin America. So thank you very much, Professor Florencia. You have 20 minutes now.
Thank you, Ana Claudia, for the invitation. The most interesting exercise for this presentation will be me speaking slowly because I'm going to speak in English. And maybe that's challenging for me to speak both slowly and in English. So my presentation has been written in advance, both to comply with the time frame that I was given and to actually say what I want to say in this short time that I have. So my intention now is to try to make a description exercise of what the business and human rights scenario looks like of Argentina. This is not that common. I was actually trying to combine some of the other presentations that I've made and look actually for other presentations and papers that perhaps were written by other people describing the business and human rights agenda of Argentina. And this is not easily to achieve. There aren't any papers on this subject. And actually, it's not that common from countries of the global south, especially those that don't have an national action plan on business and human rights. So this description exercise is actually a rather complex task that I will try to achieve in the next 19 minutes. As I said, I think this is difficult for most countries that don't have a national action plan developed, not because of a lack of activities or efforts in general, from both governmental, civil society, and business representatives, but because those actions are diffused rather than organized around a public policy that can set standards to improve compliance with international standards on business and human rights. So my intention is to map and present some emphasis on some of the key elements of the business and human rights agenda from a national perspective. It would be impossible to present a national baseline evaluation at this point, so my objective is much more modest. Argentina's law system has had a close relation with the concept of corporate social responsibility, and please bear with me as I say corporate social responsibility of governments and private subjects since the early stages. Firstly, ever since the reinstatement of the democracy in 1983, Argentina has been bound by major international treaties on human rights. Indeed, our national normative hierarchy grants a supralegal status not only to treaties that have a constitutional standing, but also to treaties referring to human rights issues, even if they may not meet these constitutional standards. Additionally, by normative hierarchy, integration and international treaties subscribed by our nation are given a superior status over the other national laws. The 1994 constitutional reform incorporated into our constitution the right of all inhabitants to a healthy, balanced, and suitable environment for human development, and the right to make sure that productive activities satisfy the current needs without compromising the needs of future generations and are under a duty to preserve them. The Constitution also recognizes the constitutional hierarchy to consumer rights, thus ensuring protection to consumers and users of goods and services. Hence, they are entitled to the protection of their health, safety, and economic interests, to adequate and truthful information, to freedom of choice, and to conditions of equitable and dignifying treatment. The same could be highlighted about labor, gender, diversity, children's rights, including those rules on access to justice, all those closely connected to the business and human rights agenda. Even more so, if we discuss the impact of the business and human rights agenda of the civil, commercial, and commercial code reform, which was over the last years, which we can discuss later if there is time in the Q&A section. There's a remarkable interest in corporate social responsibility, and I use this concept because it's the extended concept in the country, the most extended one. And it's been, there is an interest developed in Argentina mostly since the social, economic, and financial crisis of 2001 and 2002. Additionally, ever since 2004, and as part of the UN Development Program, the Argentine Republic adhered to the Global Compact, thus giving rise to the Global Compact network in Argentina, which began with 247 adherents in 2004 and has reached over 800 members across 20 provinces in Argentina. We are 23, so that's a lot. Argentina has a national contact point for responsible business conduct created in 2006 in accordance with the country's adherence to the OECD Declaration on International Investment and Multinational Enterprises in 1997. The NCP functions within the National Bureau of International Economic Negotiations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In terms of structure, the National Contact Point is a single-party organization that is composed of representatives of one single ministry, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It lacks budget, its own budget, because it works within a ministry, and its administrative structure has both part-time and full-time employees that participate and organize activities throughout the year. The NCP has an advisory body with representation from other ministries, academia, business organizations, trade unions, and civil society representatives, and went through a peer review process during the last quarter of 2019, being the first non-OECD country to go through this process. By reading the reports published on the specific instances conducted by the NCP of Argentina, it is possible to conclude that the results of these interventions have not been favorable to the affected parties, being evident a series of problems in the way in which the actions were conducted, specifically because these specific instances fail to comply with the standards and requirements imposed by the United Nations guiding principles for state-based extrajudicial mechanisms, and with the general principles applicable to the specific instances conceptualized by the OECD guidelines, in accordance with the fundamental criteria for functional equivalence of the national contact points. The results are not encouraging, even more so when tensions are observed between the principles that monitor access to reparation mechanisms in relation to the way in which the procedures are actually conducted. It is important to point out the relevance of the Office of the Ombudsman as the national human rights institution. It has a broad mandate to promote and protect human rights, and a relevant role, on the one hand, in promoting the respect of human rights by companies, and on the other, in the protection of people and communities affected by the negative impacts of business activities. Since 2017, the Office of the Ombudsperson actually has a business and human rights program that has among its objectives to identify, exchange, promote good practices, as well as to formulate recommendations and exhortations to national states and companies, whether these are public or private. The role of the Office of the Ombudsperson of Argentina has been highlighted in the framework of the agenda for the next 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles, indicating the special impact that its activity has had on the promotion of standards on due diligence for responsible business conduct. Throughout 2018 and 19, Argentina undertook the task and the effort to prepare and elaborate its first national action plan on business and human rights. To that end, several actions from different national ministries were set in motion in order to coordinate tasks and public strategies in issues such as environment and territory, forced labor and human trafficking, discrimination, gender equality, and children's rights, including child labor. The National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights was a compromise made by the Argentinian Republic within the National Action Plan on Human Rights, a more general action plan that did not came into force before the final months of the administration. Nevertheless, for this purpose, and on the basis that public policies on human rights must reach alliances with both private sector and the civil society to achieve effectiveness, the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights intended to work towards strengthening of institutional capacities with plans and projects that could reinforce the synergies between public and private sectors. It was sought to promote the regulation of responsible conduct of companies in line with the provincial regulatory experiences in matters of corporate social responsibility, such as those enacted in the city of Buenos Aires, Rio Negro, La Rioja, Salta, Mendoza, Chubut, Tucumán, y Entre Ríos. Over the last weeks, Argentina has presented to all stakeholders its decision to elaborate a national action plan on business and human rights, acknowledging the existence of the work that was undertaken by the previous administration. This decision was previously exteriorized by the government during the 47th session of the Human Rights Council as part of Argentina's international commitments. The intimate link between business and human rights and the Sustainable Development Agenda is unavoidable, insofar as it is not possible to achieve sustainable development without ensuring full validity and due respect for human rights. This is actually part of the conversation at this point when the country is actually considering to elaborate a new national action plan, or the first national action plan. At the national level, the Business and Human Rights Agenda is also linked with not only the SDGs agenda, but also other experiences, such as the Plan for Equal Opportunities and Rights, the National Anti-Corruption Plan, regulations of the Securities Exchange Commission, and several other initiatives on gender, sustainability, transparency, integrity, and corruption. And the scenario sets in evidence the diversity of approaches and problems that are integrated into the agenda and that need articulation of efforts of different ministries, but also multiple territorial jurisdictions. The business and human rights approach has not been largely explored by the National Private Law Academy, without prejudice to the existence of a broad and developed set of works on corporate social responsibility and its articulations with the rights system. It is also noteworthy that at a regional level, the Inter-American Judicial Committee, one of the principal organs of the Organization of the American States that serves the organization as an advisory body on juridical matters to promote the progressive development and codification of international law and to study the possibility of standardizing legislation across the countries of the hemisphere, commissioned and approved in 2014 a report submitted by Dr. Fabián Novak Talavera that was presented as a guide to corporate social responsibility in the field of human rights and the environment in the Americas. Finally, Argentina has maintained a rather neutral position in the context of the discussions to regulate, from a human rights perspective, the obligations of transnational corporations and other business entities, engaging in the conversations to point out the importance of including gender perspective and gender responsive mechanisms to the binding treaty, but maintaining on the side of more substantial discussions. So this was my intervention to my idea was to sort of present a map of where we are. And I know it's short, but I didn't want it to make it long and maybe difficult to follow up. So thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Florencia. It was great. And I have so many questions about that, especially because you're talking about private international law. And well, we've been talking about this, especially this year, we've been talking about private international law in Latin America and business and human rights. How can we engage more professors and students into studying that? So I'm really happy to hear this lecture from you as well, and to learn a bit more about that. I know we just have 20 minutes, but I think it's a great time and a great introduction for the topic. And now we are going to listen to Professor Daniele Pamplona, and Professor Daniele will talk about business and human rights and its developments in Brazil. So we are all very curious about it. Professor Daniele, thank you very much for being here. I'm very happy to see you again, and you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Anna. I am really happy to be here. So I want to start by thanking for the invitation, Professor Rafael, Professor Anna, and also to the Cátedra Jean Monnet. I want to say that it's an absolute joy to share this panel with my dearest friends, Salvador, Florencia, and Ana Cláudia. I'm really happy to be here. So as Professor Anna was mentioning, I intend to walk you through the history of business and human rights in Brazil, and hopefully to get to the point where I can tell you where we stand nowadays. And just pay attention, because I'm telling you about the story of business and human rights. And this is a very specific term, as Professor Salvador was telling us earlier. But the subject, meaning that it's quite new, but the subject itself, it's not really new in Brazil, if we take into consideration that to speak of business and human rights, it's actually to speak of economic activities and their negative impacts on people and on the environment. So although we do recognize the positive impacts, this is not what we will be talking about when we talk about business and human rights. And of course, this is really, really old. So we could go back to the colonization process that we all had something really similar here in Latin America. And we can translate that process into a process that is essentially of exploitation by other states and then by their legal entities. And even after that, we can talk about the decolonization process, which is also very similar across the continent. And we will see that it actually leaves a trail of economic activities that are left on this territory to exploit what the government can no longer exploit directly. So these private entities, these economic activities that are left behind, they make strong ties with the states where they are now, like the newly free states. And these strong ties, they will translate into very little regulatory space for these new countries. While in history will actually demonstrate that the conduct adopted by what we now call the developed countries was very different from what they now preach as ideal conduct for the developing countries. So they took care of their markets. They used, for instance, tariff protections to guarantee growth and economic strength. And when they reached the position of developed countries, they changed their discourse and started to tell us that what was really, really good is free trade. So of course, this free trade lacks the absence of barriers, limitations, restrictions. It's like they had it all under control to grow, but to keep their level of growth, they will need the rest of us to be as liberal as possible. And it means that we do not regulate, not, of course, other states, but we do not regulate the activities that are being held here in our country. And the post-Second World War was, or the version of the Second World War of this arrangement are what we call investment agreements, which will follow the same logic. Okay, we lack very little room for maneuver when we think about, of course, the states that are the recipients of the investment. And so this was sold as the salvation table for the underdeveloped countries. And it is, in fact, a maintenance table of the status quo achieved by the developed ones. And if we add there the transnationalization of economic activities, the threats to human rights, to the environmental rights, they only increase. Okay? The transnational activities carried out here in Latin America, they are essentially of exploitation of natural resources. So, of course, that the guarantee of profit for these companies comes from the flattening of environmental and human protections. So, little by little, some people will wake up to understand how evil this arrangement is in the long term. In fact, this is really little by little. It is still really common to find discourses, for instance, like the ones that will tell us that they actually enjoy all the material goods that we have now, and they do not worry about a future that they won't be part of. But what I believe is that climate crisis and the pandemic, they have opened some eyes. And I speak this really, really carefully. And I explain why. Because speeches that will normally pin the hope of the future on the young, they are really commonplace. So in time, if we look back, this is something that has been said before, and I'm really not sure how well we end up after all this, after the time passes. So if I remember well, even Socrates saw in young people the possibility of change, and he was killed because of that. Well, I mean, he was killed because people will say that he was corrupting young people. So we don't really have much guarantee that today's young people will become adults that will share the same concerns that they used to share when they were young. But this is not a reason for us to stop educating and reflecting. It's only a concern really that I share, because I really hope that this moment will be, the present moment will be an effective watershed. It would be just a moment to open the eyes. So just to go back in history then, all this historical development, it's full of events where these transnational companies are involved with the negative impact on human rights. And then we have this movement at the UN, and I'm sure that you've talked about this in other panels. So between all the comings and goings, we have nowadays two different directions that are not really exclusive of each other, but we do have the working group that foments the adoption of national action plans, and the other group that is actually involved with the process of a treaty. Well, I'm talking about all this, and I promised you that I would walk you through what Brazil has been doing on this subject issue. And in the international arena, Brazil has had an active participation in the treaty process. Okay, so it got involved in discussions, and this is much more than many other countries have done during the sessions. But despite of this international action and the discourse of engagement in this theme on business and human rights, the way I see it is that we have few reflexes in the domestic arena. Okay, so I would say that actually there is an abyss between some initiatives and the reflexes that they are capable of generating. So it's like we do have some initiatives, the ones that I'm going to talk to you about, but when we look at people on the ground, we don't really see that all those beautiful things that are being announced, they do have a concrete reflect. So I want to start by telling you that we did received a visit from the working group on business and human rights in 2015, by the end of 2015, and this has generated a series of recommendations to the state, to our state, to public and private companies, and also to civil society. And to the state, one of the recommendations was that we should build a national action plan, okay? Well, but this was not the only thing that we had in Brazil regarding this theme. In 2017, 2 years later, we were under the Universal Periodic Review mechanism from the Human Rights Council, and we had more than 240 recommendations, but at least 5 to 6 countries will actually tell Brazil that Brazil should prepare a national action plan on business and human rights, aligned with the guiding principles, which I know already that you know what I'm talking about, the guiding principles on business and human rights. Here in Brazil, the main responsible in the government for advancing this agenda is the National Secretariat for Citizenship of the Ministry of Women, Family and Human Rights. And it has taken part in some initiatives. So it has participated in a publication of a survey that was trying to find what would be the right measures to establish an agenda for the state regarding business and human rights. This survey has concluded that it was necessary to build to conduct a baseline study, and of course to do a national action plan after that. Well, the survey was in 2017. We still have none of them, not the baseline study, not the NAP. I'm going to call it NAP from now on. And in 2017, we also had a public hearing that was under the care of the Federal Prosecutor's Office for the Rights of Citizens, which has also gathered some information so they could make an action plan for a working group on business and human rights that they had there inside the prosecutor's office. We had the publication of an open letter called Companies for Human Rights, while telling that companies will commit to human rights, but we haven't heard of this no more. We had in 2018 the publication of an ordinance from the Ministry of Human Rights providing on the procedures for the signing of a term of commitment with businesses under the protection program for human rights defenders. And we have no word, there are no news at all about any company that has been contacted to adjust to the rules and to even sign this term. So what about, what can we say when we even think that Brazil has not ratified the Escazú agreement, the one that Professor Salvador was talking about? So it's like there is a divorce between everything that we see. Like, it's so great to see that the state has an initiative bringing the companies all together and to try to make these companies conduct or just have practices that will not be harmful to human rights offenders. But then what is it that we see in the country? We still see human rights defenders suffering menaces and so much harm also from private corporations. But then in 2018, just to follow with my story here, we had the publication of a decree 9571, which I'm sure you've heard about. This is our national guidelines for business and human rights, which are clearly structured according to the 3 pillars of the guiding principles of the UN. And they were really strongly criticized by academia, by civil society, especially because they lack participation of any other stakeholders. Okay, so this was only government taking care of their elaboration. We do have other initiatives that come from our state. There's also, I always mention the role of the Global Compact Network in Brazil, which has been important, at least, not only that, but at least to talk about the subject. So they really give voice to this, but we need to, we need to pay attention and see that, of course, they do not reach all the companies in Brazil. Okay, so, but for the ones that are there, that belong to Global Compact, they do have a real strong voice. Well, and oh my gosh, the time. But then I do not want to finish without mentioning that by the end of 2020, there was a publication of a resolution number 2 of the National Investment Committee of the Chamber of Foreign Trade here in Brazil. And this resolution will approve the mandate for this committee to prepare an action plan to promote the responsible business conduct, the one that Professor Florencia was telling us about. Okay, so despite all the initiatives that we have, what we have the most concrete initiative here in Brazil nowadays, it's actually this committee resolution. And of course, we had there a plan of how this national plan will be built. And they were thinking about applying a quiz to government and then a quiz to companies. And then they will consolidate all the information. They will make some interviews with specific cases, and then they will go to public and ask civil society probably what they think about it. And finally, they will publish this national plan. While we are in November 2021, we were supposed to have all the first steps done by now. So this should be by the end of the process, finishing the language of the plan, but we still were a bit late. So we still are applying the quiz to the companies. There's no consolidation of information yet. And actually, we do not have that much information about how the things are being done. And it's really funny, actually, because Brazil has spent, since 2011, when the guiding principles were adopted, we have spent all this time not discussing about a national action plan. And suddenly, it seems that we're going to have one by the hands of the Ministry of Human Rights and another one by the hands of the Ministry of Economy. So this is, my goal was to try to show you that, yes, if we're going to ask the state what is that the state is doing, of course he has many initiatives to show us and to tell us that they are working on the subject issue. But the thing is that there's still an important part of the population that increasingly, not less, but more and more suffers from the negative impacts of the economic activities. So I'll say that we do have some positive impacts, but they will come more and more from conduct that the companies will just adopt because they think this will actually grant them some other positive impacts for themselves, and not because of what the state has been doing. So this all comes from an exercise in observation of natural resource exploitation activities. So just to tell you, this is quite narrow if we think about all the possibilities of economic activities that we have. And if we only take these activities that explore natural resources, we come across so many vulnerable communities despite all the initiatives that the state has already taken. And we still haven't even opened our eyes to, not the eyes, but I would say the Pandora's box of the food industry, or even started to discuss, under the light of business and human rights, the use of agrotoxics in the country. So I would say that spaces like this, they're really relevant, so that of course we can debate our choices also, our options also, so that people can see the extent of the harm and the limitations of each one of the actors, because we in the academia, we do have limitations, at civil society will have limitations, but as we do join our forces, we might get stronger. So hopefully I'll say that with Brazil finally getting on the team of states who have an app, either one produced for or by the Ministry of Human Rights or the Ministry of Economy, I would hope that we will be able to move on, because we do have enough experiences of NAP building for us to build upon. So we know already what are the main critics, and we could even be clever enough to try to avoid some of these critics. So this is the story, how business and human rights goes in Brazil. This is where we stand. I will say to you that I am optimistic in the way that we will have more visibility to the theme in Brazil in the coming months and years. And hopefully all this visibility will take us to a better place, not only for academia, because we will have something else to talk about, not only for state, that he will add another initiative on their bucket, but mainly, and this is the main concern, for the people who are on the ground. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Ana.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniele. I see here that we already have some questions that were presented, especially, I don't know, I think it's from some of our students here. But I would like to present a few questions as well to the professors, and please, if you if you could just address your answers in a few minutes, because then we can have space for more questions from the public as well. So, Professor Salvador, I have a question here that is, nowadays we are talking a lot about climate litigation. This is a reality already in some national courts in the global north. Do you think that this will also be a trend here in the inter-American system of human rights protection, and also in national countries from the global south? And do you think that the Escazú Agreement will also take part on some of those decisions? So this is my first question to Professor Salvador. I think I will address all my questions, or what do you think? I think it's a good idea just to address all of them, and then you can take your time to answer those questions. To Professor Florencia, here I would like to learn a bit more about private international law here in Latin America, in the global south, and what are some of the main characteristics of Argentine private international law that can contribute to strengthening the business and human rights agenda. I think it's important to hear that from you, especially because you are in Argentina and you know so much about it. I think it's interesting to get to know what your system, what your country can contribute for the discussions here in the Global South as well. And Professor Daniele, you have mentioned many of the Brazilian states' initiatives on business and human rights. And what about our judiciary branch? Where is the Brazilian judiciary on business and human rights? Do you think that we still have many challenges to face on this topic here in the judiciary power here in Brazil? And after those questions, after you answering all those questions, I would like to present more questions for you that we have from some students. And I really encourage students and the ones who are here listening to our presentations to pose your questions as well. It will be a pleasure to answer if we have time, of course, for that. But I think the professors will be very happy to answer them. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for the questions. And again, it was a pleasure to listen to Professor Weger and Professor Pamplona. I just wanted to say, is climate litigation a possibility? Yes, for sure it is. And there are actually right now cases within the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that are focusing or having a direct impact on climate litigation or environmental litigation. Before I mention that case in a very brief manner, I think that it is important for us to differentiate environmental litigation than climate change specific litigation. And this is something that I've been thinking about in preparation for tonight, and think about the regional synergies that may happen, right, for us to advance specific fields or thematics at a regional level, at least in the Americas. But let's say we're three nationalities here: Brazil, Argentina, and Peru. If our countries were to adopt a climate change litigation, we would still suffer the consequences of climate change, right? Our countries are not the major polluters in the world. So the impact, although significant for businesses operating within our jurisdictions, could actually change. We will still be suffering the consequences because China, the US, the EU would not be part of this agreement. So in a way, climate litigation can have a role, but climate change, and despite national efforts that for example, we're seeing in Colombia, where they adopted the model of the teenagers that presented a complaint to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, is significant, and it sends a message that we need to address this because the states are failing us, and that's the message. For a climate change as a whole, we need to have everybody on board. Otherwise, the impact, as significant as it may be nationally, in the outcome, well, we're all gonna die. On the environmental field, it's different. And for example, right now there is a case of the Uwa indigenous peoples versus Colombia, right now in the court's docket, where it is pretty much how to apply the Convention of Biological Diversity and and under the scope of human rights. The advisory opinion 20 on environment of human rights has already mentioned some of these elements, as well as the ruling on the Calini and Locono from 2015. But I think that with the changes that the court has done in the past 4 or 5 years, we're really waiting for that leading case on how to states' fulfillment of environment and human rights. I've mentioned the Escazú agreement, and I think, and also Professor Pamplona had mentioned that in her presentation. My feeling is that within 2 years, if not less, the Escazú agreement will be an integral part of the American Convention of Human Rights, regardless if the state has ratified it or not. The court has done that in other cases, especially the Almonacid Arellano versus Chile, for non-statutory limitations on crimes against humanity. But that's a different field, that's for a different webinar. But my understanding is, if we make the match between inter-American environmental standards and the Escazú agreement, there's not much difference. Participation, transparency, respect of biological diversity, indigenous peoples' recognition as guardians of the earth. All of these elements are already within the inter-American system. So, for example, my country has subscribed but not ratified the Escazú agreement. Brazil has the same thing. Colombia has done the same thing. All environmental powerhouses, because we share our common future, which is the Amazon. So I think that this is where the system is going, and the cases at the inter-American and national level will only be able to streamline it and be more specific about the specific duties of states. So I'll leave it here, Professor Hui, and sorry if I took a bit more time than expected.
Thank you very much for your answer. I think now Professor Florencia could answer my question, and then we could just go turn to Professor Daniele.
Thank you, Anna, for your question. This is actually a two-part question, so I'm going to try to concentrate on private law characteristics from Argentina, which are not only characteristics from the private international law, but from the private law in general of Argentina. And the first thing that we should signal out is not only it has changed after the constitutional reform in 1994, where, as I said, we included a reference to some rights, private law rights, and actually we have a reference to torts on environmental torts within the Constitution. But we have this undeniable connection with human rights and private law in the Constitution itself. So given this introduction of the set of human rights treaties with constitutional standing, the map has changed radically since 1994, but it also has changed after the reform of the private law system as a whole in 2015, when the Civil and Commercial Code was reformed. Actually, there were two codes before that, and now we have one that actually comprises the regulations of private law. And this transformation kind of goes beyond what is said within the context of the Civil and Commercial Code. So after this reform in 2015, the idea was that the Civil and Commercial Code could reflect the relation between public and private law based on the constitutionalization of private law, and represented a complete transformation of the system itself. So some of the key characteristics of this civil and commercial system that we now have can actually contribute to reinforce the business and human rights agenda itself. And if we should just focus on some, we should include the different functions of civil liability, which are now expressly introduced within the Civil and Commercial Code, and its articulation with human rights instruments with constitutional standing. The new private law structure actually builds on the idea of a plurality of sources, conforming a complex system that often calls for an interaction of different sources of law, and the use not only of rules, but also principles and values. So as I said, the first 18 articles of the Civil and Commercial Code, which are the preliminary title, go far beyond the Civil and Commercial Code itself, as those provisions are actually applicable to other relations that have not been included within the regulation of the set of rules that are within the code, and therefore are governed by other areas of law, such as corporate law and employment contracts, among other possible examples. So in this scenario, the judicial system, the courts mainly, who are vested with the harmonization and coordination of the national legal rules, are the ones that need to work on this integration of different sources of law. Alongside the civil liability rules that are included in the private law regulation of both domestic and private international law rules, relations actually, it is necessary to consider the impact of the precautionary and the preventive principles. I actually love the preventive principles because it's kind of like the due diligence. It has a resemblance with the due diligence element as we know it in business and human rights agenda. And these principles, both the precautionary and the preventive principle, have constitutional standing. So since they are now included within the contract law and civil liability dispositions, there is a transcendence of the human rights law into the private law system, together with this multiplicity of norms. And the regulatory diversity that constitutes this national legal system entails the inclusion of the so-called dialogue of sources as a technique for overcoming antinomies, which is actually very well known within Brazilian private international law, the idea of dialogue of sources, and now it's part of our private law system. So this relevance of the precautionary and preventive principles, the humanization and constitutionalization of the private law system, the dialogue of sources, and finally there is a minor, not so minor reference to the statute of limitations that actually it's very relevant to the business and human rights agenda, because there is the substantive regulations governing civil liability present this final noteworthy element, because although there is a 3-limit year for claims for compensations arising from civil liability claims, there is no statute of limitations for civil claims deriving from crimes against humanity. This was actually included because of our history with the last period of a non-democratic government. And so this reference is actually a novelty within the private law system. And those are actually the things that I think are more relevant for the business and human rights agenda from a private law perspective. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Professor Florencia and Professor Daniele.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Professor Ana. So you were asking me where the judiciary branch in Brazil will stand regarding the business and human rights agenda, or the issues rising from business and human rights studies. Well, I would say that despite the fact that the guiding principles will tell the states that it needs to guarantee coherence among all the different organisms inside the state, this is not something that really happens in Brazil. And so despite all the initiatives that I did mention, our judiciary will not really know about the subject, about business and human rights. So we do have one specific magistrate, a judge, he's at the federal, at the labor court, and he's in South Brazil, even southern from where I am. I would say his name because I think that we need to know him because of what he's doing, but I really can't remember and I couldn't find it here now. But he's the one who has been using the guiding principles on the decisions that he is rendering on, just to remind us that the guiding principles will actually be ground to tell us that legislation cannot go back regarding the rights, labor rights that we already had in the country. So this is the one, and it's the only one I've heard of. So if we take steps up and we take a look at the other courts, I mean, we will see that the fact is that nobody really talks about that at law school, so we don't know about that when we grow up into the legal system. And of course, that if we don't talk about that at law school, we will also have an absence of the issue when we take a look at the other courses that are available for people, for graduates. So there is a lack of the state. Okay? I would say that the state should do more. And we do have a specific case to talk about that, because we just had a decision at our Supreme Court regarding a legislation from a state, the state of Roraima. And this legislation was talking about the mining process, and not only the miners, but also the prospectors, the gold prospectors. And what we try to do there through an amicus curiae piece, so this is exactly where civil society and academia can join forces and try to shed light on the subject. We were trying to make the Supreme Court see the discussion through the lenses of business and human rights, because I think that this is the important thing that we can do with our judiciary, while we cannot talk about a national action plan or we cannot talk about the treaty. We have to actually show them that there are so many issues that have been discussed in our judiciary that do belong to business and human rights. And once you understand all this, you know, all the system where this discussion, or the system that the discussion belongs to, the decision that you're rendering should be different, should be, you know, actually finding grounds on the inter-American system, on the American Convention, even in our Constitution in a different way from what is being done. So we did work with this amicus curiae piece, trying to shed light on that. Thankfully, the decision was really good, but we need to say that we had a good result, but not because of the attention that was given to the business and human rights issue. And why? Because this is still not really relevant. And this is a discussion that is urgent to be made in all Latin America. And I would say that as Professor Salvador was saying by the end of his speech, I'll agree with him. I think that what we need is to actually pay attention to the fact that we share the same hurdles, the same difficulties, and we do need to find a common way out of this. And of course, the judiciary has a really big role to play, especially here in a country like Brazil, where we know how far our judiciary can go. And well, just to finally to summarize my answer, I'll say that our judiciary can still walk a lot. There's miles to walk there, but we really need to talk more about the subject, and I'll just tell that the state is the one that should be doing its part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniele, for your answer. We have two questions here that I'd like to pose to all of you, and please feel free to answer. I think we can use the same order, but please feel free to answer the first or the second, whatever you prefer, okay? So the two questions are, there are still difficulties in reaching the ground, the rights holders, especially in the Global South, where corporate power is very strong. So how would the UNGPs, the guiding principles, and other international standards evolve in this direction? And I think this is something that we need to hear more about the Global South perspective, of course. And the second question is, there's a huge difference between policy and action. So how can we evaluate the NAPs, the National Action Plans, in the Global South, or even discuss about the translation of international standards to the Global South reality? I think it's interesting to talk about that. And also, if you want to add something to the treaty process, if you would like to present something about it, I think it's also interesting, because then we'll have the NAPs, the UNGPs, and the treaty process, and then we can bring this to discussion to the Global South perspective. So, Professor Salvador.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. I mean, for the Global South, we have pretty much the only thing we have is civil society and academia. The states have failed us across the board. Latin America is the most dangerous place for environmental defenders and human rights defenders in the world. Pick the country: Peru, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. Across the board. And since we're reaching the end of this webinar, I'd like to be more on a personal side and less academic. I'm getting tired of all this crap about NAPs and UN guiding principles and self-regulation by corporations. We work on cases every single day from different countries of the Americas, and they're always the same problem. Right? The state is, we're identifying where, if you wanna stall anything, create a committee, a multi-sectoral committee. Okay? And this is what happens. And this is not to undermine the impact of NAPs and the importance of NAPs. This is a new field, and NAPs as policy to identify what do we need to do. But if there are no concrete actions, if there's no significant change, are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? What I mentioned to you before in the presentation is true about Peru. Heralded as one of the best NAPs in the region. And in no way I'm undermining the merits of the team, because due to the political instability of my country, the fact that we actually had a national action plan on this matter is a success as a whole. But considering that Peru has been taken to the ICSID for arbitration on 29 cases, and that there's not a single word about policy coherence between international investment agreements and protection of human rights, does that make sense? Is this fair? And on the other hand, I think that all of these tools are important, but only if they fulfill a specific purpose. And that's where I think civil society and academia working together, okay? Because not because there's academia, or at least I would like to speak for myself, we all have agendas, okay? There's nothing pure or neutral about it. And my agenda is pretty much to address this as a central topic, to see that this is not just about indigenous peoples because of lack of consultation, lack of consent on extractive projects. This is about an issue that focuses on power imbalances and how the pursuit of economic development, as important as it is, there is always somebody suffering the consequence and the invisible violence of development. And those are not the 31 or 30 plus that are attending this here today. That is the motivation and that is the drive that I see, and that's why I mentioned at the start of my presentation the issue of possibilities. Because if we don't do something, if we don't do this, okay, we're going to be any attempt of regulatory change on human rights, environment, or labor that affects the bottom line of corporations. The state must defend its right to regulate and protect public goods before arbitration tribunals. This is what Odebrecht did in my country during the pandemic. They sued the country before the ICSID because because during the pandemic there was a curfew, and because this curfew affected the number of cars that were going through the highway that was lending a concession to Odebrecht, Peru was taken to ICSID. Does that make sense? Is this fair? So that's why I believe in the power of Global South and the importance of public interest litigation and advocacy between civil society and academia to actually make the business and human rights not something that fills books and webinars, but something that can change people's lives for the better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Salvador. Professor Florencia, go ahead.
It is actually hard to follow Salvador because he should have finished. We should have ended with what he said.
But then you ended in a positive note, Flor. That's the great.
Always.
If they finish with me, everybody would be crying and depressed, go to bed.
Maybe that's what we should be doing. So I wanted to add just one little thing to the second question that Anna brought to us on the difference between policy and action, and what are the ways we can evaluate the actual implementation of national action plans from a Global South perspective. I think there are maybe two comments that I could do. The first is that this idea that we should break with structures and try to change everything and do things differently for countries of the Global South and mainly from Latin America. It's really difficult because of our position within the global supply chain, and we need the infrastructure that foreign investment can give us. And I'm speaking from an Argentinian point of view, which is a kind of really difficult. So we have this tension between what we need to do and what we can actually do with national action plans. But maybe we should start looking at this problem from a global perspective and try to include us within this sort of trend that's being kind of present within the European models. But besides that, in spite of what we can actually do from the Global South, I think there is one element that we should actually consider when we are trying to evaluate processes and the implementation, the actual implementation of national action plans with an inter-American perspective, and that's using the San Salvador Protocol indicators to measure what we are doing and how we are doing it. And I'm not the expert on this. Maybe we should have Denise Coufret to speak about indicators, but she's not here, so I'm going to mention her and send everyone to read her. But besides that, I think we should just take advantage of what we actually have here, and we have these models and we have these structures, and we know what these indicators of structure, procedure, and results mean, and how we can use them to measure what we are actually doing when we implement national action plans. So having indicators, real, actual, relevant indicators to measure the way that the national action plans are impacting in our lives and in the policies of countries is actually the thing that we need to stress when dealing with the difference between actual policy or action. That's all I wanted to say.
Professor Daniele.
Yeah, I share with Florencia the concern of talking after Salvador, but then let me try, Salvador. It's not really easy to be, an optimistic person after everything you said, but I will try because, I was born with it. So first, I'm going to address the first question very briefly, Professor Anna. I would say that, yes, of course, that the example I just gave, like the use of amicus curiae, is one of the ways that we have to, to try to tackle the power of the corporate power, as it was mentioned on the question. And I will share with Salvador that the really way out is the pressure from civil society. I mean, so much has been made already through civil society pressure. So I would say that this is important, and because I do have to say something about what Salvador has mentioned, I want to just make a liaison here to say that civil society will not be able to do much if we do not share knowledge. And this is a concern that I have. I mean, concretely to share knowledge from academia, for instance, we do need like money. You need, funds for our research. We need funds so we can actually call civil society and try to explain to them what legislation is saying, what people are telling on the international arena. And one of the ways that this will happen is, at least here in Brazil, this is how it would work. I mean, if we do, for instance, have a national action plan, we will probably have funds to discuss it. So this is how we will share knowledge, which is so important to civil society to do their part too. And of course, that we know already that self-regulation, it's not the answer. It doesn't really get close. I briefly mentioned that. I didn't want to actually say something about that, but we know that already. But if we can agree that all those tools are important tools, as Professor Salvador was mentioning, I think that we can also agree that the deep changes that we need, despite the fact that we are who we are, the natural resources are here. So this is where people are gonna come to exploit them. So despite this, I would say that we could also agree that in order to make these deep changes, we need common people to understand what's happening. Okay, it's not working if only academia will know, or only like this high profile NGO will know what the subject issue is. We need people to understand. And I just want to give you this very small hint on something that I've mentioned, which is we haven't discussed the food corporations yet. We haven't even started to discuss them. I mean, common people need to understand why it is so harmful to buy, I don't know, Doritos. Oh my gosh, I spoke against this corporation. I'm going to be dead by tomorrow. Okay, but not only because it's bad for
that's
your
not
health.
food.
Exactly. But you know what I mean? It's not only because it's bad for your health, but what comes behind all that. So again, I would say that this is our part being done. We are academia and we need to speak about that, and we need to explain to people how harmful all it is. And more than that, people need to understand the background picture. They need to understand where it comes from, so they can actually decide, they can give their consent knowing about things. So this is it. So I would say that I'm optimistic, because if we take a look from our perspective here in Brazil, the more we have the chance to talk about the subject issue at hand, the more we'll be actually convincing people that this is important, that this is relevant. And actually, this is an issue that it's cross-cutting all the other issues that you want to talk about in the whole legal system that we have. There's no way of talking about anything if you don't talk about business and human rights. Now, there's no public policy nowadays without talking about business and human rights. So this is my optimistic view, that please let me just go to bed tonight thinking that we will have the chance to give some steps forward. We will have the chance. I don't know if we're going to do that, but at least the chance will be there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Daniele. Professor Salvador, before you speak, I would like to ask you a question, because everybody here is kind of depressed with the words, but no, I'm just kidding. But why do you still stubbornly believe in this potential of the inter-American human rights system, and why do you keep working with business and human rights? Because I think this is something that, although your words are a bit depressive, I think we still need to find some potential and some positive words in your studies and in your research. So could you please also give us some of your thoughts about that, and also to complement what Professor Daniele said, of course.
First of all, I am a positive. I'm a happy person. I don't know. Sorry, I forgot. I mixed languages already. Okay. Desculpa, eu sou uma pessoa muito positiva. Okay. I wake up with a big smile on my face and I go to bed. Anyway, but I think that we have the solutions. Okay, and this is in no way I'm trying to mention that Brazil, Argentina, Peru, there are resource-rich countries, and for the medium term, that's our only way out of poverty: the exploration of natural resources. Okay, that's a bit of real politics. But a host state, cannot be sued because they declare the Amazon a resource mining free area because of the cultural diversity, the biological diversity. And for our students here that are listening to us, I would invite you to read the bilateral investment treaty between Morocco and Nigeria. And in this treaty that is not yet in force, there's a small section there that pretty much states that in the application of this BIT, the state will not be undermined to regulate the environment, the protection of human rights, and labor rights. It is a simple term. It is a simple article within this BIT that if you use that as a template in all the other BITs for years to come, it gives whole states like Peru, Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, that if you're adopting norms to protect regulations for the people, that to fight corporations that are trying to pass Doritos as healthy food, you give the state tools to actually fulfill its constitutional duty. We have the options. We have the alternatives. So, and this cooperation between academia and civil society is that makes our lives richer, and we feedback each other. And I hate to put them actually as on the different way, like on different terms, because I think that we are all civil society at the end. Well, some of us get paid or precariously paid to read books, okay? But at the end, we're all in the same boat, okay? And when I mentioned about the neutrality, something that perhaps you saw, that in this big case on climate change litigation against Shell in the Netherlands, no scientific testified on behalf of the people. So this is a significant problem as well that we need to see. We have different sides, we have different agendas, and the role of cooperation, in a way, Professor Rui, that answers your question, is that if there is any system that fosters participation and public engagement of all of us, is the Inter-American Human Rights System. If any one of you here would like to submit a case to the Inter-American Court, an amicus to the Inter-American Court, you just need to have an internet access and send your arguments within 2 weeks after the adjournment of the public hearing of any specific case. And I invite all of you to actually try to do that, whether you're interested in indigenous rights, business and human rights, women's rights, whatever is your topic, it's completely open for all of you. So that's the positive way, in the positive that there are tools and there are means for us to move forward and for us to advocate for positive change. With a big smile on my face.
Thank you very much, Professor Salvador. I think we are running out of time, so I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. Professor Salvador, Professor Florencia, Professor Daniele, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to thank Professor Rafael Miranda, Professor Claudia Marconi, and Cátedra Jean Monnet for the opportunity, for the invitation, and for the partnership. I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I really do hope that we can keep working together, all of us, not just here in Brazil, but also in Latin America, and counting on you, Professor Salvador and Professor Florencia and Daniele, to work together and keep working on this matter on business and human rights here in the Global South. So thank you very much to all of you. I would like to ask Professor Daniele, Salvador, and Florencia if you want to make any closing remarks, if you want to say something else, and also to the ones that are here.
I'll just thank you again, Ana, for the invitation. Thanks, Professor Rafael. When I left there, my Twitter handle, if anyone wants to keep chatting about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So have a good evening, everyone, and hope to see you soon in some other event on business and human rights.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
Até logo. Thank you. Até logo. Hasta luego.
Bye-bye. Good evening, everyone.